Hello and welcome back to Fundamentals in Ecology. My name is Umesh Srinivasan and I am at the Center for Ecological Sciences at the Indian Institute of Science. And today in Fundamentals in Ecology, what we will talk about is climate change and how climate change is affecting biodiversity. So we'll be looking at climate change in some detail. As we all know, the climate on Earth is changing. It's changing as a result of the fact that we are burning fossil fuels and pumping what are called greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. These greenhouse gases are gases like carbon dioxide, water vapor, methane, and so on. And what they do when they're in the atmosphere is that they hold on to heat, they trap heat. And so it's like being inside a greenhouse. So these gases are creating greenhouse-like conditions, leading to increases in temperatures on the surface of the Earth, both temperatures, water temperature as well as surface temperatures on land. And on average, the temperatures on Earth have increased by about 1.3 degrees Celsius since pre-industrial times. So this is because of the fact that we're burning fossil fuels, or burning things like coal, petrol, diesel, and so on, creating high concentrations of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. There are two types of climate projections. These are models. These are predictions of what might happen in the future because of climate change, and under different scenarios, under different conditions, under different expectations of how we as a species might respond to climate change and either do things or not do things to mitigate climate change. In the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change in the year 2000 came out with this special report on emission scenarios which were based on greenhouse gas emissions. And what you're seeing here is, for example, this is the change in temperature since the year 1900 to the year 2000, and if there is some kind of effort taken to reduce climate change, then under that scenario we might end up with an increase of a few fractions of a degree of climate change. That has of course not happened, but under conditions where we continue to burn fossil fuels at the rate at which we are burning them, we might end up with climate change of about 3.1 degrees Celsius by the end of the century. 10 years later, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change replaced the SRES, or the Special Report on Emission Scenarios, with another set of scenarios called RCPs, or Representative Concentration Pathways. These are based on what are called radioactive forcing scenarios, which is asking how much energy is coming in to the Earth per unit surface area, how many watts of energy are coming in per meter square. And these different scenarios are based on different levels of radioactive forcing, different levels of energy coming in to Earth. And so if the RCP is 2.6, then that's relatively lower energy coming in, leading to lower climate change by the end of the century. Whereas if the amount of energy is say 8.5 watts per meter square, then that's a large amount of energy, and that will likely lead to about a 4 degrees Celsius rise in average surface temperatures by the end of the century. This does not mean that all parts of the world will warm equally. Some parts will warm at faster rates, some parts will warm more than other parts of the world. But what these projections are doing is to predict, is to model what might happen under different scenarios by the end of the century. Now, we know climate has changed. We know that mean surface temperatures have increased. We know that that's also causing an increase in the frequency and intensity of extreme events like hurricanes and cyclones and so on. And obviously biodiversity will respond to this change in the atmosphere, this change in the environmental condition. One of the ways in which species are responding to climate change, one of the ways in which they are adapting to climate change is through what are called phenological shifts. Now, phenology is a term that describes the timing of important annual events in the life cycle of an organism. So, for example, migration, the timing of migration, the timing of reproduction, the timing of flowering, the timing of fruiting, all of those things are what make up the term phenology. Let's look at this system, which is a plant-pollinator interaction. You have bumblebees that feed on nectar produced by certain plants. And what might be happening is that the plant might be using day length to as a cue to time its reproductive activity, time when the flowers are blooming, right? And bumblebees might be using temperature as a cue to come out of hibernation. Now, over evolutionary time, the timing of the bumblebee's emergence has co-evolved to coincide with the flowering of these plants. And so when the plants flower, or when the bumblebees are also active, and the bumblebees then feed on nectar, they get a reward from feeding on that nectar, but they also provide a service which is pollination to the plant, and so the plant also benefits. So it's a symbiotic relationship. What is happening now is that the timing at which the bumblebees emerge from hibernation and when the flowers are actually on the plant, there is a mismatch between those two phenological events. That is what is called a phenological mismatch. Yeah. And so as flowering onset date, this is on the x-axis, the date of flowering on the day of the year, right? So January 1st is day 1 and so on. As flowering date onset becomes earlier, there is a higher phenological mismatch between the bumblebees and the plants, right? So as flowering becomes earlier, the timing of bumblebee activity and flowering activity, there is a mismatch there. And so what you're seeing on the right here are graphs showing you on the x-axis, for example, flowering onset date, and on the y-axis seed set success, which is how many seeds are these plants actually putting out. And so as the flowering date becomes earlier, seed set success comes down. So the phenological mismatch actually has a very important consequence for these plants, which is that because of the disconnect in the activity times of the bumblebees and the plants, they're actually putting out less seeds. They're suffering, they're facing a fitness consequence. Yeah. There could be other kinds of phenological mismatches, for example, between what this bird species called the great tit and caterpillars. Now, great tit, this is just a schematic showing the timings of various activities in the life cycles of the great tit. So on the top left, what you're seeing is that the laying dates of the great tit, most egg laying activity was happening around the 1st of May. There were some great tits laying earlier, some great tits laying eggs later, but most of them were laying around the 1st of May. That was timed, and then those eggs are incubated and then hatch. That's the timing of hatching, where June 1st is where there are maximum number of chicks of the great tit in the habitat. That timing of when the chicks are in the nest, when there are maximum numbers of chicks in the nest, has co-evolved to coincide with the maximum time when caterpillar biomass is maximum. So at this time, when the number of chicks is maximum, caterpillar biomass is also maximum, and therefore there is enough food for these chicks which are feeding on these caterpillars in the habitat. With climate change, what could happen is that these caterpillars, if they're using temperature as a cue to hatch from their eggs, they might, instead of most of these caterpillars emerging on June 1st, they might shift their emergence date to an earlier part of the time, earlier part of the year. Then, because the great tit for some reason has not shifted its laying dates, maybe the cues that it uses are not climatic cues but something else, then there is a mismatch in the timing at which there are maximum numbers of chicks and the timings at which there is maximum number of caterpillars. And that mismatch could have fitness consequences for great tits. And in fact it does. So if you look at the degree of individual mismatch in days on the x-axis, the greater the mismatch that you see, the lower the clutch size, the lower the number of fledglings, the higher the probability that 0 chicks will fledge from the nest, the lower the probability that a pair of nesting great tits will lay 2 batches of eggs. So these phenological mismatches where the timing of when the food is maximum in the environment versus when the chicks are in maximum numbers in the environment, that timing changes. It does have consequences for fitness for these species. So phenological mismatches, because of arising from climate change, do have consequences for species. Phenological mismatches can also occur between species like the pied flycatcher, which is this species here, and the great tit. Now the pied flycatcher is a migratory species. It breeds in Europe during the summer and then goes to Africa in the winter. It stays the winter in Africa and then comes back every year to Europe to breed. The great tit, on the other hand, is a resident. It does not migrate at all. Now, what can happen is that great tit laying dates can respond very strongly to temperatures. So, the mean annual temperature can be very closely related to great tit laying date, and that's what you're seeing in this relationship here. The warmer the temperature, the earlier great tits start to breed. Right? So this is timing in April days. 10 means 10th of April. And so when temperatures are warmer, great tits breed earlier. When they do that, that gets them into conflict with the dates at which the males of the pied flycatcher are arriving. That then becomes at the same timing. And because that occurs at the same timing, now great tits are in competition with collared flycatchers for nest boxes, for these boxes that have been put out to provide nesting habitat for these species. And when these two things clash in time, which is the arrival of the male pied flycatchers and the great tit laying dates, there's actually fatal competition between great tits and collared flycatchers and pied flycatchers. Great tits actually can kill pied flycatchers for a competition for nest boxes. And so actually climate change can have effects like fatal competition between two species. One of the ways in which species are responding to climate change is via range shifts. This is not migration like we were talking about with the pied flycatchers earlier, where a species goes somewhere for winter and then comes back every year to the same location back in summer. This is range shifts. This is the shift of where a species is found, where the range of a species is. And you can see some examples here of American lobster, the red hake and the black sea bass, species of marine organisms, and each of these species range center is shown by a dot in different years. The earlier years are lighter, the later years are darker. And what you can see for all of these species, let's look at the black sea bass as an example. The range of this species from 1968 has shifted from being closer to the equator to being farther away from the equator. So these species are shifting their ranges away from the equator. They're moving away from the equator, and they're shifting towards the poles. These are poleward range shifts. And this arises likely from the physiology of these species, which is a species has evolved to tolerate a certain kind of range of temperatures. With climate change, what is happening is that temperatures in their range now are rising, and so these species are likely being forced to move to other locations that have the same kind of temperatures that they are adapted to, the same kind of temperatures that they are physiologically adapted to. And you see that happening across many oceans. You see that happening in the North Sea as well, where you've got these species that have shifted their latitudinal range centers from more southern latitudes towards more northern latitudes. And so movements away from the tropics or from the equator towards more temperate regions. If you look at what are the determinants of some of these poleward range shifts, then if you look at this in fish in the North Sea is the region between the island of Great Britain and Scandinavia, this area here, the North Sea, and you look at species that have either shifted their range or have not shifted their range, then you can see that the shifting species tend to be smaller. They have lower maximum length than non-shifting species. The shifting species age at maturity. They age faster. They become mature earlier than the species that are not shifting their ranges, and they are smaller than species that are shifting their ranges. And some people think that is because organisms might not make a conscious choice to shift their range during their own lifetimes. However, when these organisms have offspring, those offspring will disperse to different areas, and because of climate change, offspring that move away from the equator towards the poles will have higher fitness than offspring that choose to remain at the same latitude. And so because of that, over generations what you see is that the population as a whole shifts its range, but maybe individuals, once they occur in a certain territory, they might not themselves move, but their offspring might have differential fitness based on where they move to, and across generations is how this poleward range shifts occur. And smaller species that become mature faster are also species that have short generation times. They'll have offspring, far greater numbers of offspring over shorter periods of time, and therefore that might be what is allowing short-lived small species that have a large number of offspring to be able to shift their population ranges faster than long-lived species that take longer to reach maturity. Poleward range shifts are also happening in terrestrial systems. This is a meta-analysis by Chen and colleagues showing that for species like, if you look on the right over here, for species like spiders and beetles and butterflies and grasshoppers, the latitude, if you look across species, the observed latitudinal range shifts in kilometers are generally away from, generally not zero, but actually higher than zero, distributed higher than zero, and tend to be away from the equator towards the poles. So this is happening for terrestrial species as well. Some fish species we are seeing are actually shifting to deeper waters. This is the case of the North Atlantic cod, which is important fisheries fish. There's been a long-standing industry dedicated towards fishing of cod, and what people are finding is that over the years, from about 1970 onwards, these cod are actually being found in deeper waters. They're actually being found at greater depths, and that might be because surface temperatures are warming, and the deeper waters still remain cool, and so some species could move to deeper waters uh, to respond to climate change. On land, the same thing that we see is happening across elevational ranges. This is data on multiple bird species. Each of these bars represents an individual bird species, and these are data from the Andes, uh, which is a mountain range in South America, from the country of Peru, where people had surveyed the elevational ranges of bird species in the 1960s across this elevational gradient, and that elevational gradient goes from 470 meters above sea level to 1400 meters above sea level on that. And so you can survey that elevational gradient and then ask, where are species found on that elevational gradient? So species 1 historically was a low elevation species found around 470 meters. So the grey bars are historical elevational ranges. These sites were then resurveyed in the 2010s, and people ask, how has the elevational ranges of species changed? And actually there are a lot of species that now have expanded the upper limit of their elevational range, moved to higher elevations, and for a lot of high elevation species, these are species that are generally high elevation species, their ranges are mostly contracted. So this species, for example, had a range from, let's say, 1000 meters to 1400 meters in the past. That species range has actually now contracted such that its range today is from about 1300 to 1400 meters. So what you're seeing in this Andean mountain range is that if you look at the change in elevational extent of the range of species, lowland species have actually expanded their ranges upwards, and therefore their elevational ranges have increased in size. Mid elevation species have shifted on average their lower limit and the upper limit of their elevational range upwards, and so their elevational range size has not changed over time, it remains around zero. The mountaintop species have actually endured range contractions, and so that's a negative impact on them, where the ranges are becoming smaller and smaller, and as their ranges become smaller and smaller, they reach the tops of these mountains and there's no other place to move up to, and so what happens then is local extinction. These species go locally extinct, and this has happened in this Andean mountain range, where 6 or 7 species of birds have actually gone locally extinct because their ranges have contracted and they've reached the tops of these mountains and there's nowhere else to move up to. That's referred to often as, this phenomenon is often referred to as the escalated to extinction. And so these are elevational range shifts of so you have cod moving to deeper waters, whereas terrestrial organisms that are found in mountains are actually shifting their ranges to higher elevations. Now, elevational range is limited to the thermal niche of a species. Low elevation species tend to be warm adapted. High elevation species tend to be cold adapted because it's warmer at the base of mountains and cooler as you go higher up. But these ranges shift at different rates. Some species might be more thermally sensitive than others, and so what we expect to see with elevational range shifts is that extinctions at high elevations and defaunation or loss of species at low elevations, because as these low elevation species move to higher elevations, there are no other species that can come in and replace them, and so we're likely to lose species at low elevations because they're shifting their ranges, and lose species at high elevations as well because of extinction. So what are these? Why do different species have differences in how they the rate at which they move? And so Montaigne, Clegg and colleagues looked at this very question and asked, for example, as species body masses change, is there any difference in the rate of shifting of these species in elevation? And actually small species have positive shifts. Small species shift their ranges. Larger species don't seem to be shifting their ranges, and that could be twofold. The reason could be twofold. One is that larger species just based on surface area to volume considerations. Larger species might be thermal generalists, they might be able to tolerate a wider range in temperatures and might not need to respond as quickly as smaller species, or that smaller species reproduce faster, put out a greater number of offspring, and therefore across generations are able to shift their ranges to higher elevations. This is also correlated with territoriality. Does a species hold a territory? Non-territorial species seem to be able to shift ranges, whereas year-round territorial species are on average not likely to shift in elevational range. A very strong predictor of whether a species will shift in its range or not is whether it is found in a tropical or a temperate system. Let's say, hypothetically, that if temperatures increase by 0.2 degrees Celsius, that you would have to move 100 meters higher to be able to be present in the same temperatures that you were present at in the past. Tropical species are actually moving 93 meters. They're matching, they're tracking temperatures 93%. So what you have here on the x-axis is latitude, absolute latitude. So that is the equator, and as you go away towards towards the right on this x-axis, you're moving away from the equator. These are multiple studies that have been done looking at the rates at which various species are shifting their elevational ranges. And tropical species close to the equator track temperature by about 93%, whereas temperate species farther away from the equator don't seem to be tracking temperatures as closely as tropical species. This indicates, and so you will see that here as well, temperature tracking in tropical species is far higher than temperature tracking in temperate species. And this indicates that tropical species are thermal specialists. They're adapted to narrow ranges in temperatures, they're adapted to narrow temperature spaces, and they might need to track temperatures faster by elevational range shifts than temperate species. However, and so what you're seeing with this is not just defaunation, but also the loss of species interactions. There could have been interactions between two species that are lost because one species has moved to a higher elevation, and as that one species moves to a higher elevation, that could give rise to new interactions, because two species that were found at two different elevations have never interacted with each other in the past are now together in the same elevation, and you can have new interactions arising from that. And we still need to understand how interactions are going to be lost and how new interactions are going to develop. Not everywhere are species shifting their ranges as fast as would be predicted from climate change. These are again data from South America looking at range shifts from 1969 to 2010. Based on temperature, one would expect that species would shift their ranges, if they were to track those temperature changes perfectly, would shift their ranges by 152 meters, but the average upward shift is just 49 meters. So there's about 100-meter lag in the response of these species to climate change, and it doesn't matter what these bird species eat in terms of their diet, whether it's fruit, insects, nectar, or these species are omnivorous, but their shift rates seem to be similar. And the question is, species that rely on fruit, for example, if they shift their elevation faster than the fruiting trees or the fruiting plants that provide them with their food, then are the impacts on species like frugivores likely to be higher than impacts on species like insectivores, which can move to higher elevations and still find insects. Some of the more counterintuitive impacts of climate change are actually downslope range shifts. Instead of shifting upwards, you have downslope range shifts, and this is seen in insects that lay their eggs in water, and the larvae hatch and they feed in water, like the stonefly larva on the left here. These species have external gills, and they're exchanging oxygen and carbon dioxide between water and between the water and their bodies through these external gills. Now, as temperatures rise in these montane freshwater systems, in these streams in mountains, metabolic oxygen demand also increases. So the demand for oxygen for these species also increases. And species vary in their metabolic sensitivity. They vary in something called Q10, which is if temperatures rise by 10 degrees, this is just a measure of the physiology, one of the aspects of the physiology of these species. If temperatures rise by 10 degrees Celsius, then by how much does this, by what factor does the metabolic rate of the species increase? But oxygen supply to these organisms also increases with temperature, because the efficiency of these external gills becomes higher, of these membranes becomes higher with increased temperature. Oxygen in the water shows patterns with elevation in temperature. Colder waters have more dissolved oxygen, and as you go higher up, water becomes colder, but the amount of oxygen in the atmosphere comes down. So all of these things put together can actually cause species, because of the fact that elevation and temperature cause things like metabolic efficiency, dissolved oxygen and so on to change. It might make actually sense for an organism to keep its metabolic efficiency at its optimal level, to shift downwards rather than shift upwards. So you could actually see downslope range shifts for some of these organisms. Climate change has caused local extinctions of species in certain habitats, and if you look at locations where there has not been extinction versus locations that have seen local extinction, represented by those grey bars there, counterintuitively actually places where there have been no local extinctions, mean temperature change has actually been higher than places that have not that have no local extinction. This might seem strange, because you would expect that places that have warmed faster should have more extinctions than places that have warmed less fast. But you see that pattern when you look at maximum annual temperature. Places in which maximum annual temperature has risen faster show local extinctions, have local extinctions, whereas places where maximum annual temperature has risen slower, the number of extinctions, the extinction rate is lower. And one can ask, what if a species actually, if the strategy of the species to deal with climate change, if it is dispersal, it is shifting its range, what is the probability of a species going extinct under different representative concentration pathway scenarios, 4.5 and 8.5, if the way in which a species, the only way in which a species can adapt to climate change, can respond to climate change, is through dispersal, is through range shifts, then species extinction probabilities are high. That's because ultimately they will end up with nowhere else to go. There will be no other way in which they can, no new place that they can move to. Whereas if the species can shift its niche in some way, if the species can, for example, physiologically adapt to these new temperatures, or morphologically or behaviorally adapt to new temperatures by remaining in the same place but doing something different, then species extinction rates are much lower. So dispersal or range shifts are not a guarantee that a species will remain in the long term. Species extinctions will happen even if species respond through geographical range shifts. The species can respond to climate change, and ecosystems can respond to climate change in various ways. So what you see is change in temperature here, which is climate forcing that's happening gradually over time, and the ecological response of a species to change in climate. Now, if that ecological response closely tracks change in climate, then that response is likely to be adaptive if there are no lags in responding to climate. If climate changes in a certain way, but the ecological response is slower than the rate at which climate has changed, then there is a lag or a debt which is likely to lead to reduced fitness. And then there could be situations where climate is changing slowly, but ecosystems change abruptly. So when going from some temperature from here to here, the ecosystem might still tolerate that change, but suddenly it might be that it's no longer possible for that ecosystem to tolerate that new abiotic environment, and so therefore the ecosystem switches from being, for example, a rainforest to a grassland. Here are some abrupt, this is modeled, this is predicted ways in which all the organisms within an ecosystem might respond to climate change. So you've got, for example, change in temperature historically, and then how that is going to change in the future, and you're asking what percentage of species in this habitat are exposed to temperatures that are no longer something they can physiologically tolerate. And so you're seeing in historical time, 0% of species are exposed to temperatures that they cannot tolerate in that ecosystem. 0% of species in that ecosystem are exposed. Suddenly then you get a jump at about 2075, where the number of percentage of species exposed jumps from 20% to 57%. And if you look at this over over long periods of time, in places that are tropical, the Coral Triangle, the Congo Basin, the Amazon Basin, species, 100% of species will be exposed to temperatures that they are not adapted to at some point in time. And some of those changes can occur abruptly. So it's projected that in the year about 2040, you have about maybe 15% of species in the Amazon Basin exposed to temperatures that they cannot physiologically tolerate, and that number might jump suddenly from 15% to almost all of the species in the Amazon now being that's because tropical species are thermal specialists. Tropical species are adapted to narrow ranges in temperature. Whereas if you go to a temperate habitat, a temperate location where species are thermal generalists, they're exposed to large differences in summer and winter temperatures, for example, even with the same degree of change in temperature, even by 2100, maybe in the Gobi Desert, only 15% of organisms will actually be exposed to temperatures that they are physiologically not possible to tolerate. So that was some of the impacts of climate change on biodiversity. Thank you very much for joining, and see you next time.